Welcome to Scandal Water, where the tea is hot and the conversation lively.
Your hosts, Candy
And Ashley
will discuss a peculiar story somehow related to the entertainment industry. This podcast might not change the world, but it just might satisfy your thirst for an intriguing tale.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1.
Hi, Ashley.
Hello, Candy.
Happy spring break.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You're on spring break.
It is. It's the first day of spring break.
Are you going to have a good one?
I am. I'm excited. We're going on a little trip.
That'll be nice.
Yeah. And I'm also excited because this episode that we are going to record today is going to be super special. You know what it is. Our audience is going to be thrilled, I think, to join us on this one too. But to share an extra special surprise that's going to go with it, I thought I would let this little clip speak for itself.
The husband and wife team of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz ruled the television airwaves in the 1950s as Lucy and Ricky Ricardo with their groundbreaking situation comedy, I Love Lucy. A total of 180 episodes aired from 1951 through 1957, producing some of the most iconic moments in television history. Recreating some of those moments are the husband and wife team of Carrie and Jeff Ketterman as Lucy and Ricky Ricardo.
Very cool.
So guys, our theme, of course, for the month is these comedians who built an empire. And our focus today will be Lucille Ball, along with her husband, Desi. He'll feature in a lot of this too. And so we thought it would be so fun and such a treat to have our friends, Carrie and Jeff Ketterman, who we know through the theater community. That's how we met them, and we are proud to call them friends. They were kind enough to send us several audio clips that you are going to hear sprinkled throughout this episode, and also some little videos that we are going to be sharing on our website in our show notes, and also on our Scandal Water podcast Facebook page.
Very nice. Very nice. And I have not heard these yet. You asked me not to listen to them, so I'd have a fresh perspective.
That's right. We thought that would be a fun surprise.
Yes.
Well, Carrie and Jeff are such Lucy and Desi fans that they have actually created their own tribute show around this celebrity couple, and they will tell us at the end. We're going to hear some of their events that are coming up, but this is why they know so much about Lucy and Desi, and they can offer their perspective as we talk about their lives and how they were these people who built an empire.
Sounds like Carrie and Jeff are building their own empire.
Exactly. They also have a really cool trailer that we're going to talk about here.
The not so long.
The Not So Long trailer, exactly. So Ashley,
Yes.
Tell me about I Love Lucy. Is this one of those shows that you watched growing up, or where are you with it?
You know, actually, I just saw clips. I have seen all the famous clips, you know, the Vita Benjamin and the grapes and all that kind of stuff. But it's weird to say that I didn't watch her very much because I love Carol Burnett. And Carol Burnett is one of her mentees. I guess she mentored her. But I had this thing as a kid where loud voices scared me. So she was really loud in that.
She was loud.
And I think the way that she spoke was almost like somebody who needs a microphone when you're on stage and you're projecting, but you're not mic'd. So she kind of had that loud projecting voice, and it just always kind of scared me when I was younger.
Well, that is interesting.
Yeah, and nothing against her.
Right.
I recognize her contribution to society. I really like that Carrie and Jeff have made a career of doing this. But just for me personally, when I was littler, it just frightened me.
She wasn't this comforting maternal figure to you. She was just a little too maybe aggressive and it scared you a bit?
Yeah, a little too aggressive. If you haven't noticed, I was a bit of a weird, sensitive kid. If we haven't touched on that before.
You were not a weird, sensitive kid, I'm sure. But okay, well, that's super interesting. So, well, then, did you watch the documentary?
I did. I did.
Wasn't it great?
It was very good. You know, the first half of it was a little tough. I preferred her when she was in her earlier career, before she became Lucy Ricardo, because she didn't have the scary voice. She talked like a normal, well, quote unquote, normal person to me. But the second half of the documentary, when they got to, I don't guess this is spoilers, but when their daughter was talking about when Desi was passing away and the last phone call together.
Oh my goodness.
I teared up.
Me too.
I was very moved. And the part where he was very sick and she came over and Lucy Jr. put on episodes of their show and they were just watching it together. And it really struck me how for the first time they were watching this show as an audience, but they also had all of the memories that are attached with it. So like if you and I watch a movie or a program or a stage show that we were a part of years later, we see it, but we also remember what went into it. Yeah. And I just felt this overwhelming melancholy and sadness thinking of their whole lives and how much they loved each other, but yet could not be together.
No, they could not have a relationship that lasted anyway.
Yeah, and one of the points that Lucy Jr. made that really hit me is she said the reason they started this show was so that they could be together. And now America has this show and they didn't have each other, which is all they ever wanted.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Wow. I thought that was powerful too. Guys, if you have not had a chance to check it out, what we're discussing is the documentary that was directed by Amy Poehler called Lucy and Desi. And
Amazon. It's on Amazon.
And it is, I thought, amazing. And what I thought was super cool, and Ashley's kind of already touched on this a little bit, is that it's really told primarily by Lucy and Desi themselves and also their daughter and all these people close to them, because Lucie Arnaz Luckinbill is the name of Lucy and Desi's daughter, and she reveals that her parents had kept these audio tapes. She estimated more than 20 something.
Yeah.
And they actually took these audio tapes and you were hearing so many memories that were recounted by Lucy, some from Desi, and then again, filling in all these other friends and family members, and their daughter Lucy played a huge role in this, you could tell. And
you know, something else that, and I don't know if we're going to talk about this later, but I like to try to say it when I'm thinking it. Something else I came away with was a huge amount of respect for both of them because they came from absolutely nothing.
Right.
And how much they loved family and how important family was to them. But also my respect for Desi.
Yes, I agree.
And how much he was involved in her success. And I did not realize how integral he was to the success, and how, I guess, I also identified with him a little bit as someone who did not have the education for what he ended up doing. And he just kind of figured it out as he went. He made it happen. And she did too, but she, by her own admission, she said when he ran things, she just got to be the clown.
As you guys know, we kind of always like to start in the beginning and then we walk through the history. So we are going to, of course, go through their lives, but just a little spoiler alert. It was interesting to me that Desi actually started from wealth and then lost it all when he moved from Cuba to America. And that's when he had to start all over as basically somebody who had nothing. So,
and I think we need to rephrase that. He didn't move here. He was a refugee.
That's exactly
and
right.
I liked the point that somebody made in the film where they said an immigrant is someone who wants to come to this country. A refugee is someone who has to for political reasons.
He loved his homeland. I mean, he would have gone back. Like that was something that he dealt with his entire life. So yeah, I'm glad you made that clarification. So going back to the documentary, from the Los Angeles Times, here is a brief summary. It says, this fast-paced cradle-to-grave recounting of Ball and Arnaz and their famed collaborations, creative, romantic, and familial, is chock full of irresistible archival footage and photos, captivating film and TV clips, and stirring, previously unheard audio of Lucy and Desi unearthed from daughter Lucie Arnaz's treasure trove of family memorabilia. The rare audio material mainly features excerpts of an interview with Ball conducted circa 1965 for Ladies' Home Journal and eventually used instead as a basis for her autobiography called Love, Lucy, that is actually sitting right here beside me on the table because your mom found this and brought it for us, didn't she? Awesome. And then to finish out the summary, it says, it offers an intimate, emotional window into the legendary actress-comedian and her unique place within both showbiz and her often fraught marriage to co-star and business partner Arnaz. The Cuban-born band leader, actor, and producer is heard here in revealing recordings made late in his life for a never-published second memoir. So that's where all this information came from. And you can tell why it was so powerful when we got to see it and hear it. And just one last thought about that documentary before we jump in. I agree with you. I absolutely loved Lucy, the daughter Lucy, her overview where she talks at the start of the documentary and says quote, at the core, it's all about unconditional love. And that just framed it for me because I felt it. Like that is what it was. It was this story of this couple who could not be together, but it was still like that love was there throughout.
Yeah.
Well, before we move into talking about Lucy's history, here's just a tiny bit more, since we've just been talking about Lucy Jr. And is it okay if we call her Lucy Jr. just for clarification? And
I think so, yeah.
I just don't want listeners to get confused.
Right.
Okay, so since we've just been talking about Lucy Jr., I thought it would be fun to play a short clip from Carrie and Jeff where they talk about having the opportunity to meet her at one point.
I heard they did that. That's neat.
So let's take a listen.
So in 2018, we did have the chance to meet Lucy and Desi's daughter, Lucie Arnaz. We were performing at the Jamestown Lucy Fest in Lucy's hometown, Jamestown, New York. And it was also the opening of the National Comedy Center, which is fabulous, by the way. It's such an interactive and unique experience that I highly recommend you check that out if you're ever in the Jamestown area. But anyway, we had just finished performing and we were walking through the Comedy Center and somebody had said, oh, you might want to go back a couple of rooms. Lucie Arnaz is walking through. So after having just performed, we were still dressed as Lucy and Desi, and we kind of both walked into this space at the same time and saw Lucie Arnaz, and we both looked at each other like, should we bother her? Like, is this going to be okay? And almost at the same time, we both kind of looked at each other and were like, can I get a picture with you? And I was just blown away. She was so nice. We ended up getting several pictures with her and chatted, and I'll never forget that she kind of elbowed Jeff and was like, my dad would have killed for those shoes. He had on these black and white spectator shoes a la Desi, and it was just so neat to have that connection and be like, oh my gosh, I'm talking with Lucie Arnaz, and your parents were Lucy and Desi.
Yeah, she was just, so very kind, and she was enthused. She was actually excited, and that kind of made our day, the fact that she was so excited about us as we were about her. And she talked about how her parents would have loved this, and she truly appreciated the fact that we were honoring her mother and father with what we were doing. So that meant a whole lot to us. That really did.
Wasn't that cool?
That's so neat. That's so neat on a couple different levels, because I can appreciate how it would feel for Carrie and Jeff to meet the child of your absolute heroes. And then I like that Lucy Jr. or Lucie Arnaz, I guess we could use those terms interchangeably, how supportive she is of her parents and how much she loves her parents and wants to continue their legacy. Sometimes kids of Hollywood legends, they don't feel that kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like that impetuous to just continue the family. But I feel like with both Lucy and Desi, that family was so important.
Right.
Lucie Arnaz was the one that took care of her father.
Yes.
In his last days. So that's just moving on a couple different levels. So I like that. I really like that.
I agree. And while we've kind of paused here and we've shared a little bit about Carrie and Jeff running into Lucy doing their tribute show, let's go ahead and also play another clip from there where they just briefly explain how they got into doing this tribute show.
I'd really like to know that. Yeah.
I guess it started with the camper, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we, both of us grew up, with the love for I Love Lucy and Lucy, but we actually didn't start really entertaining until we made the camper, and then people kept drawing correlations to us as Lucy and Desi, and we thought, well, why not? Why don't we just do an act? And that's kind of where that started, really.
And we all know each other from the entertainment and theater world, so it was just an extension of, well, why don't we create our own little tribute show to our favorite duo? So thus the Lucy and Desi tribute show was born.
About 3 years ago? 4 years ago? 4 years ago.
Okay.
So it started with a trailer. Very interesting.
Isn't that cool? Yeah, I never knew that either.
No. And they do have a physical similarity to them, especially Carrie with her hair.
They just do such an amazing job with the physicality, with the costumes, with recreating some of those scenes. I think our listeners are really going to enjoy checking out some of the material that they've shared with us.
Very cool. And we're kind of talking in such a down tone. We are excited about this. It's just, I get overwhelmed with melancholy thinking about people who have these these grand legacies, but just their personal lives couldn't work out. And nothing against their secondary spouses, because like Lucie Arnaz said, they were married to their second spouses for longer than they were together. And she said the public never didn't accept Gary Morton. They just ignored him, and they continue to.
Know. It's so sad.
So I'm not trying to dissuade their second spouses. I think they were very happy with them, but it's just so sad to me that this love that they had just could not work.
Yeah, it's funny that I'm glad you named it, because when I went into this episode and I started researching Lucille Ball, I was just like, wow, I did not realize how many amazing things this woman has done. And it really was kind of this more upbeat note. But pretty quickly, I went in and saw that documentary, and it changed my whole angle.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, instead of it just being about Lucy, I was really enmeshed in their relationship. And it is sad that they didn't work out. But I'm glad that you've kind of brought it to my attention. There's so many wonderful things here. So we do need to be excited about this.
It's good. We are excited about her, but there's just, I don't know. It's hard to make heartbreak seem happy. We're going to work on it.
We are. Here we go.
Okay.
So let's start at the beginning. So Lucille Desiree Ball was born to Henry and Desiree Ball in Jamestown, New York on August 6, 1911. And according to Lucy's own autobiography, Love Lucy, that we've already referenced, their family moved a lot. They lived for a time in Montana, then Michigan, which is where Henry, who was an electrician and a lineman, found work with a telephone company, Michigan Bell. But tragedy struck in 1915 when Lucy was only 3 years old. Her dad died after illnesses. It kind of sounded like a combination of things. I heard typhus, but I'm not sure exactly. But basically, a few years after Lucy's dad died, Desiree remarried a man named Ed Peterson, who was, they described him as a metal polisher. And the family moved soon after that to Celeron, New York, with Lucy's grandparents, which of course we saw in the documentary.
Yeah. Are you going to talk about the thing that happened with that? Okay, because I need that to be clarified for me, because I was a little confused about it. So when we get to that, clarify it for me.
Okay. It said in one source that Lucy's family was among 3 families that were living in that house. So it sounded to me like the grandparents were taking in other relatives as well. And in her own autobiography, Lucy wrote, quote, "My grandparents had little money, but they gave us a richly satisfying family life."
That's great.
And so I feel like that's the basis for everything that you were saying about their love of family and their dedication to each other. So they were poor. They were admittedly struggling for money, which means that everybody had to work to try to make ends meet. And we heard, I think in the documentary, Lucy was talking about selling hot dogs at one point. But she spoke very fondly of her childhood. She loved her grandfather in particular, and she felt like she had a good childhood there, and so she seemed very grateful for being taken in that way. Lucy's brother Fred, who we also heard on the documentary,
I wonder if that's why she named her neighbor Fred Mertz.
I don't know, but that's the
first thing I wondered.
I like that. But on the documentary, he talked about his grandfather being very kind, and he said because they'd lost their biological dad and grew up with their grandfather, that they really saw him as their father figure. He's the one who kind of stepped into that dad role. And of course, one thing that their grandfather did was take them to vaudeville shows every weekend. He was huge into that, and Lucy credits him for sparking her interest in the entertainment industry because of doing that. But then there was the tragedy, which I think is what you were referencing.
Yeah, so explain it to me, what happened.
It's interesting because I pulled some of this from the documentary, but I also found not many sources gave details, but I found one source that tried to fill in a few of the gaps. So guys, this is the best I could figure it out. If somebody has more to add, please come onto our Facebook page and fill us in. But it said that when she was in her teen years, her grandfather came home one day with what she described as a, quote, mysterious object wrapped in brown paper. And it was a birthday present for her brother, Fred, on his 12th birthday. And of course, that object was a .22 caliber shotgun.
Okay.
Now, she recalled, and it was quoted that in some source, she said that her brother wanted to shoot crows right away. And so their stepfather, again, Ed Peterson, he set up some places where they could target practice with tin cans in the backyard. Now, on the documentary, Fred himself describes the tragedy. He does not mention Lucy being present, so I'm not sure if she was there or not.
Okay.
All he said was that he was there with his girlfriend, is how he referenced her, and a neighbor and the grandfather.
Yes.
So what it says, all the sources agree, basically what ends up happening is that the neighbor boy, a boy named Warner, ended up getting shot by the little girl, Joanna, the girlfriend. And here's how one source said it. Now, I didn't find anything corroborating this, so this is one source, but it said, allegedly, when it was Joanna's turn to shoot and she picked up the firearm, Warner's mother, that's the neighbor boy, Warner's mother called out for him to come home. Warner ran right in front of the rifle just as Joanna fired.
Okay.
He was rushed to a local hospital where doctors discovered the bullet had severed his spinal cord, leaving him unable to walk again.
Okay, that's the part that was confusing to me, because on the documentary, it sounded like they said an adult stood up as she was shooting. And I thought, was it Grandpa? Mm-hmm. And then when they said that Grandpa ended up getting sued by the family, it sounds like the only connection they had was it was their weapon, but it was the girlfriend who did this. So why was it that her family, because it was their weapon?
Well, the way it sounds to me is they're all on Grandpa's property, grandfather's property. He's the one who had given he's in charge. He's the one who had given the rifle to the 12-year-old boy, was letting these kids play with it in his backyard.
Okay.
So I think he was held responsible, basically.
Yeah, that's what I was confused about, is why, if he wasn't the one wielding it, but it was more like you were the adult in charge, this is why you're being held responsible.
And Lucy did say in the documentary that when they sued, they also made very ugly allegations. So she said, if I get this right, that they were accused of using the boy for target practice. Yeah, she literally said, they said, quote, horrible things. Oh. So I think there was also that. There were some allegations made that it was very, very ugly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, it was devastating. She wrote, this is a quote from something she wrote herself, "My grandfather never worked again. The heart went out of him. It ruined Celeron for us. It destroyed our life together there." And on the documentary, we hear her say on one of her tapes, he was never the same.
You wouldn't be.
No.
You wouldn't be.
No,
You
how
couldn't
would you
be.
get over that?
No. But what strikes me is, again, here we just talked about, we're going to be happier, and then we talk about this tragic event.
Right.
How many comedians' lives are built on tragedy because they want to make other people feel the way they did not feel. Does that make sense? Like, how many people have so much suffering in their lives that they want to bring happiness? That's why they want to bring happiness.
I like that thought. I think it also speaks to wanting to overcome. Like when you have hardship, when you have bad things happen, a lot of times people who are very strong-willed, like it makes them more determined than ever to overcome and to make good and to move on. Well, according to her daughter, Lucie Arnaz, Lucy left for New York City as soon as she was old enough, but things didn't go as well as she'd hoped. It said that she went to try to take acting lessons and they sent her home. According to Lucie Arnaz, they said she had no talent and that her mother was wasting her money.
Wow.
So Lucy Jr., Lucie Arnaz, said that her mom stayed in Jamestown a few more years, did some plays here and there, but she was always acting out. She was always pretending, putting on shows like this woman was meant to perform. So after a few more years, Lucy's mom told her to go back to New York City and try to pursue her dreams, and that's what Lucy did. So according to the documentary, Lucy was only about 15 or 16 years old when she first tried to make her way in the entertainment world. She started out trying to be a showgirl, but she was not very good at it. And Lucy was so self-deprecating.
Yeah.
She would say she was a dud, or like she really was down on herself.
Well, know thyself. I mean, maybe she was, and she's just like, hey, that's just what I was, and I appreciate that. I like it when people are honest about what they were able to do.
I liked it too. But then she knew her strengths, because even in the documentary, she said she turned to modeling and she was good at that. She acknowledged she was good at it. But she decided she needed a new identity, so she took on a new name and said she was from Montana. And the new name she picked was Diane Belmont. And according to Lucy herself, she said, quote, "I always loved the name Diane, and I was driving past the Belmont racetrack and the names seemed to fit together."
It does. It's very glamorous sounding.
So she was incredibly successful as a model. She modeled everything from dresses to hats to cigarettes.
She was beautiful.
She really was. At one point, she became a Chesterfield girl. And in one of the articles, it said, quote, "America grew to know her on billboards, magazine ads, and on posters in drugstore windows." She was getting her name out there as a model.
Or Diane was.
Diane Belmont was from Montana. But her break into film came when she was cast as one of the showgirls roles in the movie Roman Scandals, which came out in 1933. And it said in the documentary that, this was Lucy talking about it, she said it was so last minute that they didn't have time to do a screen test.
She said, which is good because I'd have been terrible.
That's right. She wouldn't have made it. But because they couldn't do a screen test, she got that gig. It was supposed to take 6 weeks. It ended up taking 6 months. And that is where she realized she was meant for this and she was never going back. Her daughter, Lucy, is quoted as saying, quote, "She went with the Goldwyn girls and made a movie called Roman Scandals with Eddie Cantor. And she was only out of work for 24 hours the rest of her life."
What?
I mean, that was, I think, being facetious, but she made the point. Like, that's it. That's what set her off on her career that made her mom basically a workaholic in that field forever.
Yeah, and I did get that too from the documentary, that she was definitely a workaholic.
She was a workaholic, and she also was very much in demand. Like I think it was a statement on the fact that once she broke into it, people wanted her. Like, she was always getting jobs.
And you got to capitalize on that. That happens now. You know, we'll see a couple years where Charlize Theron will be in everything, or Jennifer Lawrence will be in everything, Chris Pratt, all these people, for a couple years they'll be in everything, and then they drop off. And I think they realize that, like, I got to capitalize on this while I can, because now we have more stars. Back then we didn't have as many, you know, and it wasn't as many choices. So she was sticking with it as long as it was going to take, and it ended up being a long ride.
Yeah, this woman was a hard worker. She talked about the fact that back then you didn't have like set working hours.
Right.
And she might have been up until 3 a.m. finishing something, and then the next day be called in at 6.
Yep.
And she was there. She was doing it. She was working hard. She would take any role.
And I think that comes from the poverty.
I think that definitely was part of it, for sure. So she was active in movies. She didn't have like leads necessarily, but she would take it.
The B movies, right? The queen of the B movies.
And she would do whatever. That was another thing she said. You know, other actresses wanted to be beautiful, but if they said, you know, take a pie in the face, black your teeth, get into a fight, she was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. She did it all. Something that I didn't know as much about was the fact that she also got into radio. Some of her earliest gigs that I was trying to find out, like, when did this start? How early did this start? And the earliest I could find was around 1937, 1938. And she was a regular on a show called Phil Baker's Gulf Headliners. And she was also on The Wonder Show, which was hosted by Jack Haley.
Phil Baker's what?
Phil Baker's Gulf Headliners. I don't even know what it means.
That?
I don't know.
But she was on it.
She was on it. Yeah. But the one that was super fascinating to me was this one called The Wonder Show, which was, back then, I think they named things after the products that sponsored them. So it was
Wonder
Bread. Yeah. And Jack Haley, by the way, is the guy who ended up being the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. You knew that, right? So she was on his show, and she was a regular. I think they called her like his sidekick or something like that. But she was on it quite a bit. She loved it. She got a good reaction. But here's the part that was fascinating to me. I found out, I'm taking just a little bit of a turn down this rabbit trail.
You're doing it, Ashley.
Sorry. But it said that this Jack Haley was the host, and what happened was 2 weeks after The Wonder Show went on the air, Fox told Haley that they were loaning him out to MGM, who needed him as a last-minute replacement for Buddy Ebsen in The Wizard of Oz. Remember how Buddy Ebsen had to drop out because he was hospitalized. He had an allergic reaction to that aluminum-based makeup they put on him, so they had to replace him. So it said this is when Haley got called out of his radio gig, and he had to spend the next several months working to film this Wizard of Oz movie by the day, and then would still have to go and work on the radio show by night.
Oh, dang.
It said he finished his scenes in the film in mid-January of 1939 and celebrated by incorporating a Wizard of Oz sketch into his January 20th episode of The Wonder Show.
Wow. So he finished filming in January of 1939, and that movie came out later that year in 1939. That's some fast editing.
They did some work back then.
That is a respect, you guys. I respect that.
Yeah. Well, one last comment is it was this early work, of course, which would lead to her getting her career-changing role in My Favorite Husband. But we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Probably a lot of people have heard of that one. Well, why don't we pause here and take a break, and we'll come back and talk a little more about Lucy.
Sounds good to me. Have some hot tea you'd like to spill? Don't forget, May is a listener request month. Submit your suggestions at scandalwaterpodcast.com no later than May 1st. If we select your topic, we'll send you a Scandal Water Podcast sticker as a thank you. Cheers!
All right, so moving on. Do you remember the story of how Lucy and Desi met from the documentary?
Oh, yes. Okay, so he was cast in a film, and she was going to play the ingenue, and she had been doing something, and she came from shooting, and she had a black eye, or I don't think it was a real black eye, it was a black eye makeup,
right?
And she walked past him, and they said, "That's Lucille Ball." He's like, "That's the ingenue? That's gonna be who plays it." But then he saw her later that night, and he's like, "What a woman!" They said, "You already met her. That's Lucille Ball." He's like, "That's Lucille Ball?" So I think he was pretty much infatuated from second sight. It wasn't love at first sight. It was not love at first sight. It was love at second sight.
I thought it was a cute story, so I thought I would let you tell that because I knew you'd remember. So to fill in a few more of those details, Lucy was 28 and Desi Arnaz was 23.
Oh, I wondered what the age
she
difference
was
is.
older.
Oh, okay.
When they met, and they were filming that RKO Studios movie called Too Many Girls,
Okay.
which, by the way, sadly, some people said later was pretty ironic considering how he turned into such a womanizer. But anyway, Desi was starring in a Broadway musical that the film was based on. And so that's how he got pulled into this film. And he was a band leader. And then Lucy, of course, was pulled in, as you said, to fill in that role of the ingenue. They said it was an unlikely match. Here she's already older than he is. She always liked to date taller, older men. And it said he was already engaged to someone else. I did not dig into that, but it was just mentioned in a source. So take that for what it is.
Okay.
But they fell in love anyway, and they ended up eloping only 6 months after they met in November
it was
of 1940.
really fast. And I think what it said in the documentary is on that first date, they talked about how important family was to them and how they were both supporting their parents. He was supporting his mother. And one thing I thought that was interesting about Desi is that he's the reason that we had the conga craze.
Yes.
I did not realize that. He brought the conga.
Isn't that cool?
Yes, very cool. And that I learned so much about him. I already knew a lot about Lucy, but I learned a lot about him too.
Yeah, same here. To kind of follow up on that age thing, a good housekeeping article I found said that at that time it was considered very taboo for an older woman to marry a younger man. And so on their marriage certificate, the couple supposedly both listed their birth year as 1914 so that it would look as though they were the same age. She was actually born in 1911. He was actually born in 1917. So they both fudged it to meet in the middle.
Okay.
It was also supposedly a little unusual for her and him to match up just because the fact that he was
dark skinned.
Yeah, he was a person of color and she was not. And so that was something else that was unusual for that time period.
Yes.
Yeah. But it said after they were married, Desi's career as an actor at MGM fizzled. So he ended up going into the Army for 3.5 years. And then, of course, he was also touring on the road with his band when he wasn't in the Army. And so, according to Lucy in the documentary, he was basically gone for 8.5 of the first 9 years of the marriage.
Yeah, they were together for I think they said in the first 10 years of their marriage, they were together 1.5 years.
Isn't that awful? I mean, I just can't even imagine. They separated for a period of time in 1944. Lucy filed for divorce. Even back then, allegedly, it was because of infidelity.
Really?
And he was doing some drinking.
Oh, see, I thought that happened more later on when he got really stressed with the job.
I mean, I think it came back, but I saw in more than one source that they had this breakup in 1944 for a time anyway.
Okay.
And they reconciled, but part of that reconciliation was them saying they needed to work together. They needed to find projects they could do together because she did think that was what was going to save her marriage.
Okay.
So their opportunity to work together came in 1948 when CBS decided to turn that radio program we were just talking about. My Favorite Husband was this radio show that Lucy had been starring in. She'd actually wanted her husband to be in it with her from the get-go, and they were like, no, and they had her, a different guy was cast as her husband. But when they decided to take it to TV, Lucy was like, no, I want it to be my husband. And they didn't
want to do it.
No, they didn't want to do it. Do you want to tell them how that happened?
I think it was Desi's idea. He said, okay, so you want to see if America will accept us, then come on the road with me. We'll do some of our sketches and we'll see what America thinks about us. And they loved them, loved them together. And that was what gave the studio the green light to think we will let you go ahead and do this.
That's right. Absolutely. absolutely. It said, here's the way it was written in my notes, sticking to their guns, they launched this touring vaudeville act, and they were basically showcasing, this is their chemistry. This is how they can work together. And as you said, it was incredibly, incredibly successful. It also caused them to launch their production company, Desilu, which was their names put together. Of course, we've already said that. But this was in preparation for them going into this TV show together. So this all kind of happened at the same time. The summer of 1950 was when they took this tour, and they also formed their company right around the same time.
Okay.
And so by 1951, CBS and their sponsor, Philip Morris, said, yep, we're ready to do this. And they okayed this weekly half-hour comedy program, which would co-star this husband and wife team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And something else I thought that Desi was really smart about, he said, Lucy's better in front of a live audience. So let's do it in front of a live audience. But he also wanted to do the 3-camera setup, and it was too expensive. So he had a rule of no retakes.
That's right.
And I don't know about for the second, third, or however many seasons they had, but in that first season, they said they did 41 shows in 41 weeks, and what happened, happened.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
It's crazy. That's like theater television right there.
Wow. Well, to kind of piggyback on that, Desilu, by the way, was the first ever independent television production company.
That's amazing.
So there's a groundbreaking thing right there.
Yeah.
And then, as you said, part of it was Lucy was better in...
She feeds off the audience.
Right, in front of a live audience. But also, they didn't want to leave their house. They're trying more for their relationship.
Yeah, they didn't want to go to New York.
So they didn't want to go to New York. And this allowed them, because they were able to do this film, but in front of a live audience, it allowed them to stay in their home.
That's right. What did he say it was? Everything was filmed in kinetoscope or something? Kinescope. And so it was really bad quality. So he said, let's put it on film. And that's what gave him the 3-camera setup. That's right. So but it was too expensive.
This is the way it was written here in my notes. When executives balked at the idea of the dominant East Coast audience watching the show by way of kinescope, which was a low-quality recording used to accommodate the time zone differences, that's when Desi suggested they record the series on high-quality film.
Right.
And that took them, as you said, to that 3-camera setup.
So it all sync up.
And the other thing was CBS and the different people producing the show said, well, hang on. We don't want to spend all this money. This is going to be super expensive. So that made, he was so smart. He was so business savvy. Desi came back and said, fine, we'll take off $1,000 from our weekly salary in exchange for Desilu Productions obtaining full ownership of the final product.
Smart man.
He later sold the rights back to CBS for millions.
Wow.
And all told, it said in one of the sources that Desilu's profits reached $5 million by 1961. So they were getting their money back so quickly. It was just amassing. So super, super smart. He was really...
He just had an intuition about stuff.
He did. Well, in the meantime, Lucy had become pregnant with their first child, and Lucy's friends later would say that Lucy believed having a baby would strengthen their bond. So, they wanted a baby, but I think she also was very hopeful that this would solidify their marriage as this show and working together would. I think she was really about this family, keeping
her
this little family together. Yeah. And it said that for a while it really worked. A quote from biographer Bart Adams said, some of Desi's womanizing was alleviated from the moment little Lucy was born. So it was going on.
Really?
Yeah, it really is. So Lucie Arnaz was born in July of 1951, and the I Love Lucy show started in October of 1951. That was really close together.
Yeah, it was. That's a lot of life changes.
So I Love Lucy started in the fall of 1951, and any reservations or concerns they have about how the public would accept this husband and wife team evaporated because it was huge really quickly. Of course, they said that the casting of Fred, who was played by William Frawley, and Ethel Mertz, who was played by Vivian Vance, was part of that, but really it was this couple that everybody loved. And they said I Love Lucy surged to the top spot in the ratings before the end of its first season. Before long, they had 40 million viewers tuning in every week.
Well, it was new. new. It was just this new way of doing it. And it's a good premise where you have the husband in the show business and he's wanting to dial back show business, and he married a woman who wants to get into show business.
Yes.
So all she's trying to do is get into it and break in, and he's trying to... That's a good conflict.
It totally is.
Yeah.
And they said that so many reasons behind why it was popular, from the fact that they were so relatable.
Yeah.
Like Lucy...
She's a housewife.
She would make fun of herself.
Yeah.
She would be the woman with the blacked out teeth. She'd
Yeah.
be the woman, so she was very relatable in addition to being incredibly funny. And I loved what the one guy, honestly, I can't remember what his job was, but David Daniels was his name. He was on the documentary, and his quote was that I Love Lucy built every episode around the idea of fracture and then coming back together.
Yeah.
I thought that was so insightful, because who doesn't like that satisfying idea of reconciliation and a happy ending of every single episode?
Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back.
Yeah, I loved it. So in the documentary, you saw the headlines and the way they were billed as, the number one team of television, America's number one show, a newspaper headline that said Desi Lucy ranked among the wealthiest. They were just raking it in. And Lucy in particular was adored. I love that quote from Desi where he said, quote, Lucy was the most loved character in the world. And he said it with such love.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
I just love that. We haven't heard from Carrie and Jeff in a while, and they had a little quote here where they talked about Lucy and why they thought she was so popular.
Okay.
So let's take a minute and listen to them.
All right.
Lucille Ball was so gifted in comedy, and I love that it was her work ethic that made that comedy so effortless. I mean, she rehearsed, and practiced until she got it right. She's quoted as saying, I'm not funny, which, is kind of funny in it itself, because she was so dedicated to her craft and she made it look effortless. I just love her style of comedy, and I love even more knowing what it took to get to that level. Her mannerisms, her expressions, everything was so practiced, and it was just that dedication to her craft that I love, and it's so entertaining to watch time and time again.
So I love that Carrie brought up that point about how much work she put into making it seem effortless. Like, that was such a great point.
It is. And we've talked about that. I think we've talked about that before, where if you're really good at your job, it seems effortless. But you know how Fred Astaire made dancing look effortless, and it was a lot of practice.
Yeah.
And I also like how honest she, again, going back to how honest she was. She's like, I wasn't that good. It was just a result of a lot of practice. So I like that she seems to be, I don't know if humble's the right word, but she seems to be very realistic.
There was a quote from a lady. She's actually the director of archives and research for the National Comedy Center. Her name was Laura LaPlaca, I believe. And it was in the documentary. And I liked her quote so much that I wrote it down. Here's what she said. I don't like when people call her work effortless. There were no advantages to being a woman in the 1950s television industry. She wasn't lucky. She wasn't a genius. She wasn't innately talented. She really built her success.
I remember that from the documentary.
Yes, I mean, like, it got me. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
And this same lady talked about the fact that she had studied Lucy since she was 5 years old, and she talked about Lucy almost having a scientific approach to what generates a laugh. Like this is an extremely meticulous, calculated thing that Lucy was doing. It really was a craft, which I think was the word that Carrie used in her little audio clip. So I love that. And one last thought was how Lucy talked about it was intentional. She was the playful character. Desi was the straight man. Like, they set it all up.
Yeah.
And to follow up on that, Carol Burnett, who you've already referenced, said that Lucy was, quote, fearless in her comedy. And she mentioned that physicality that we were talking about. And then, of course, Bette Midler said that she was someone very beautiful who wasn't afraid to look ugly, which was especially unusual at that time.
It really was.
So we asked Carrie and Jeff to weigh in with some of their favorite I Love Lucy moments, and they spoke a little bit more about the show and why it was such a strong production. So let's hear what they said about that.
Well, my most favorite come from my favorite movie, The Long, Long Trailer. I saw that movie when I was little, and I was just obsessed with the idea of having my own little home on wheels. But the situations that they get themselves into are just so funny. And of course, we know those situations with our own camper. We have our own little tribute to Lucy and Desi in our camper that we call the Not So Long Trailer, which is about a third of the size of the one that they had. But we have those moments and those experiences, and it's just funny living that camping lifestyle, and to see it played out on film by Lucy and Desi is just, it's close to home.
Yeah, and some of the funnier moments for me, I love Lucy anyway, are obviously with Desi, but I love a lot of Fred's stuff.
Yes.
I mean, I just think Fred, his character, was so well written, and he was perfect for that role. The characters in that show, all four of them, they just worked so well together, and I think that was another thing that made that show so great, was the casting of the other two, which was, Vivian Vance and
William Frawley.
I think that combination was just perfection.
It was that combination of the right cast, the right time, and the right writers.
The writers, yeah.
So Lucy had pulled Bob Carroll and Madeline Pugh from her radio show, My Favorite Husband, and you'll notice if you listen to some of her earlier radio shows, some of the same plots and even some of the same lines come across in later episodes of I Love Lucy, but that writing team was just a gem. I mean, and it stands the test of time. These moments, these situations, and the lines are still funny today, and I think that's what keeps I Love Lucy. We're still talking about her and the show.
I love some of the things that they just brought up. The writing,
yes.
it was
Yes.
powerful.
I like how she said it was a combination of all of that. And one thing, again, going back to what they talked about with Desi, is that if he didn't know how to do it, he was smart enough to surround himself with people who did. Mm-hmm. And he hired people who knew what they were doing as they were figuring it all out.
Absolutely. And then what Jeff brought up about the casting.
Yes.
I mean, that it was a combination of these things.
Yeah.
Ashley, I've just noticed that we are maybe halfway through my notes and probably looking at a pretty long episode. Do you think we should make this a two-parter?
I'm okay with it if the kids at home are.
If the kids at home were 80. I love that.
Armchair Psychologist.
Before we go, let's do our Armchair Psychologist.
Okay.
Why don't we share our thoughts
Okay.
about what we've discussed so far, what we've seen and heard so far.
Okay.
And then we'll come back and we will finish this episode up next week.
That sounds good to me.
Okay.
So what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
I beat you.
You did. You did. One of my thoughts, I think, is how little I knew about Lucy's shrewdness.
Yeah.
And her intelligence.
Yeah.
And her work ethic, which then parallels with how little I knew about the exact same qualities for Desi.
Yes.
Like they've both just blown me away
Yes.
with that.
I talked about at the top of the episode that I had nothing against Lucille Ball or Desi Arnaz.
Mm-hmm.
It was Lucy Ricardo and the loudness of her voice. So there's, nothing wrong with them. That was just my childhood kicking in. So for me, I am discovering them.
Right.
I am discovering these people that I kind of avoided a little bit and learning how significant they were in our culture and how hardworking they were
Right.
and how family oriented they were. And I'm so sad about Desi's dalliances because they didn't touch on that in the documentary, so I didn't
Right.
realize that it was as prevalent as it was to be such a family man and then to do that. That's a little disappointing to me, but okay, let's take the personal life out of it. Let's just focus on the professional side. I admire very much how he was able to come from nothing. Well, how he was able to start over from nothing.
Yes.
And to kind of guess his way to this success. And how hard she worked to be the success. And how honest she was about her own level of talent. And said, I don't care if I'm not the most talented, I'm going to work the hardest. It harkens me back to Marilyn. Because that was also Marilyn's philosophy early on.
Right.
Of, I'm going to work the hardest. I'm going to show up at 6 a.m. and I'm going to be here because what if opportunity knocks and I'm not there to answer? So I see a lot of that same drive.
And she valued that. You're talking about Marilyn made me remember something that came up in the research was Ginger Rogers. Is it Ginger Rogers who danced with Fred Astaire? And
Yes.
Lucy talked at one point about I don't remember what the role was, but Ginger's mom was somehow involved in the entertainment industry. And Lucy kind of studied under her a little bit. And so she watched firsthand the way Ginger
Worked hard
and really did not innately have this dance ability, this acting ability, any of these skills. But Lucy applauded how hard this other actress and dancer worked to get what she wanted, and that was something she clearly valued.
Yeah, I think that's what we're learning, is that we admired all these people and we just kind of took it for granted that they got to where they were because of who they are, but they worked really hard.
Yeah, either who they were or just some innate ability.
Yeah.
But these were people who went after it. Like they made it happen. They created their own success. Yeah.
I agree.
Well, let's end our first part with just a cheers to Lucy and Desi. Absolutely.
Yes. And you know who else I would like to cheers is Amy Poehler.
Yes, I agree.
For putting this together and for introducing us to a new side of them that we may never have known. So thank you, Amy, and thank you to Lucie Arnaz.
Absolutely.
So all four of them.
All
Cheers
four of
to
them.
them.
I agree. Cheers.
Cheers.
This episode of Scandal Water was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown.
That's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
All music was written, composed, performed, and mixed by Josh Martin. The artwork was designed by Matt C. Adams, while our website was developed by Joshua Reith. If you like what you hear and you want to help keep the Scandal Water brewing, please go to our website, scandalwaterpodcast.com. Just click on your podcatcher of choice, then hit follow to subscribe. And while you're there, you might as well leave us a 5-star rating and review. And don't forget, it's always more fun when you share your tea with others.
As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers,
or clearly professional psychologists.
Thanks for listening.